Imagine a land where honor was more valuable than life, where warriors in polished armor rode beneath cherry blossom skies, their every breath dictated by a sacred code. A world where a single stroke of a sword could rewrite a family's fate. This is not a legend. This was feudal Japan. For nearly 700 years, Japan was ruled not by emperors, but by men of the blade, the samurai. They were more than warriors, they were poets, philosophers, and political power brokers. Their stories echoed through blood-stained battlefields, moonlit gardens, and ancient castles still standing today. But who were the real samurai behind the myths? What happened in the shadows of the shoguns? And how did this ironclad world of honor, come to its quiet end? Get ready to journey through war, betrayal, loyalty, and the strange beauty of a world unlike any other. This is the entire story of the samurai and feudal Japan, like you've never heard it before. If you're enjoying the journey already, give this video a like. It helps more curious minds like yours find it. Don't forget to subscribe for more full-length, cinematic documentaries just like this one. And hey, if you know someone who loves history or needs something incredible to fall asleep to, share this with them. Now, let's dive in. Of Bushido long before the samurai became the legends we know today, before the armor and katana, before castles and warlords, there were just scattered clans in a mountainous land and an idea beginning to take root. An idea that honor could mean more than victory. That dying for one's lord could be more sacred than living without purpose. It wasn't born overnight. The path to Bushido, the way of the warrior, was carved slowly, over centuries of war, poetry, and philosophy. And it all began in the rugged terrain of early Japan, in a world where survival depended on your sword and your soul. But who were these early warriors? What forces began shaping them into something more than just fighters? Let's rewind the clock. In the earliest days of Japanese civilization, around the 6th to 8th century CE, Japan was still very much a land in flux. Power was loosely held by an imperial court centered in Nara and then Kyoto. But out beyond the cities, in the forests and valleys, local clans ruled with their own customs, their own justice, and their own armies. These warriors were not yet samurai in the complete sense. The seeds were there. They were known as bushi fighters, who defended the interests of regional landowners, called daimyo, and later, provincial governors appointed by the emperor. At first, these bushi were simply muscle, protectors of land, tax collectors or enforcers during conflict. But power loves ambition, as emperors lost influence. Local clans, especially in the Kanto region, grew stronger, richer, and more self-reliant. They built their own systems of loyalty and training. They passed down oral traditions of bravery and battle. They began living by a set of values, a lifestyle of discipline, loyalty, and courage. The early whispers of what would one day be codified as Bushido. So what exactly is Bushido? The word literally means way of the warrior. But it's more than that. Bushido was a moral code, unwritten, yet deeply felt. Think of it like Japan's answer to chivalry, but even more intense. It taught that a warrior must be loyal, just disciplined, honest, courageous, and above all, ready to die at a moment's notice for the sake of duty. The samurai didn't fear death. They rehearsed it. Every day was a meditation on impermanence, ritual acceptance that honor could be found even in a single perfect moment. But that mindset didn't emerge in isolation. It was forged by fire and centuries of war. By the 9th and 10th centuries, powerful warrior families like the Taira and the Minamoto were rising in influence. These clans weren't just fighting each other. They were starting to challenge the very power of the imperial court. And as Japan entered the Heian period, the world of the warrior transformed again. This was an era of elegance and refinement. Kyoto's aristocrats were composing poetry, painting scrolls, and performing court rituals with an almost otherworldly grace. But while the court enjoyed luxury, it was the warriors in the provinces who were doing the dirty work, defending borders, suppressing rebellions, collecting taxes by force. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. One world was silk and incense, the other, blood and steel. Eventually, court's inability to control the provinces led to a tipping point, and the warriors knew it. The Minamoto and Taira. Clans would soon clash in a brutal series of battles known as the Genpei War. More on that in Chapter 2, but even before that, the samurai were beginning to formalize their identity. They weren't just mercenaries anymore. They were crafting a philosophy. This was also when the katana, the curved, elegant sword of the samurai, began to appear, replacing older straight blades. Why the curve? For one, it made drawing the sword faster and more fluid. But symbolically, it represented the balance of beauty and lethality, a physical embodiment of Bushido itself. Let's pause for a second. Imagine a young warrior kneeling in a dimly lit room. His sword rests across his lap. Outside, the cicadas hum and the scent of incense drifts through rice paper walls. He is not preparing for battle. He is preparing for death, just in case. It comes today. That was the depth of discipline Bushido demanded. What's fascinating is how Bushido blended to seemingly opposite worlds, Zen Buddhism and Shinto. From Zen, the samurai inherited calmness and chaos, the ability to still the mind. In the heat of battle, from Shinto, they embraced a fierce connection to ancestors, the land, and purity of purpose. This created a paradox. The samurai was both a monk and a killer, silent as snowfall, deadly as a blade. But here's where things get really interesting. Bushido wasn't originally written down. For centuries, it existed as an oral tradition, passed from master to student, father to son. Only much later, during the Edo period, would scholars begin to record these ideas in texts like Hagakure and the Book of Five Rings. So early on, Bushido wasn't a rule book. It was a feeling, a way of being, and that way began demanding sacrifice. Loyalty wasn't just encouraged, it was everything. If your lord died, you were expected to either avenge him or join him in death. In time, this would evolve into the ritual of seppuku or harakiri, ritual suicide to preserve one's honor. Brutal? Yes. But to the samurai, it was a beautiful death. Better to die with purpose than live with shame. This was a society where betrayal could cost you your name, your family's status, and even their land. The pressure to uphold Bushido wasn't just personal, it was generational. But despite all this intensity, there was also elegance. Samurai were trained not only in combat, but also in poetry, calligraphy, music, and philosophy. A true warrior, they believed, must also be cultured. Can you imagine a modern soldier composing a poem before battle? In samurai times, that wasn't just common, it was expected. By the late 1100s, the stage was set for a seismic shift in Japanese history. The old aristocracy was weakening, the warrior class was rising. And to clans, the Minamoto and the Taira were about to go head-to-head in a bloody conflict that would give birth to Japan's first military government, the shogunate. But before we enter that storm, take a breath. Let the image of a lone samurai walking through misty hills settle in your mind. He is not fighting yet, not killing, not commanding armies. He is listening to the wind, practicing his form, and preparing his soul. Because when the storm comes, and it will, only those who walk the way of the warrior will survive. The rise of the Minamoto and the first shogunate begins with a whisper, then a march, then a scream. The year is 1180. The elegant silence of Kyoto's imperial court is about to be shattered by steel. For generations, emperors held the throne, but not the power. That was shifting now, away from silk robes and incense burners, toward the clang of armor and the thundering hooves of samurai, and at the center of it all stood two names destined to clash: Taira and Minamoto. This is the story of the Genpei War, a brutal 5-year conflict that would end an era and launch the age of the samurai. A war that gave Japan its first shogun, carved Bushido into blood. But how did we get here? The seeds of the conflict were planted decades earlier, during the late Heian period. The imperial court in Kyoto had become a symbol of refinement, but also of rot. Bureaucracy was bloated, emperors were increasingly ceremonial, and absolute power often lay with retired emperors or influential noble families behind the scenes. Meanwhile, the provinces far from the court's gilded halls were a different story. Local warlords and samurai clans were gaining power fast, building private armies and settling their own disputes by force. Among them were two rising stars, the Taira clan, led by the cunning and ambitious Taira, no Kiyomori, and the Minamoto. Descendants of the imperial line with a proud warrior tradition, it wasn't just a rivalry. It was a powder keg, and when the spark finally lit, it set the entire nation ablaze. In 1156, a brief but bloody conflict known as the Hagen Rebellion broke. Out between factions supporting rival emperors, both the Taira and the Minamoto fought in the conflict, but it was Taira no Kiyomori who emerged on top. Then came the Heiji Rebellion in 1160. This time, the Minamoto tried to take control of Kyoto and failed spectacularly. Kiyomori crushed. Then, most of the Minamoto leaders were executed, including the father of a young boy named Minamoto no Yoritomo. But Kiyomori made a mistake, spared the boy's life. That decision would come back to haunt him. Kiyomori had the court in his grip. He installed puppet emperors, married his daughter into the imperial family, and essentially ruled Japan from the shadows. But his arrogance alienated allies and sowed resentment like seeds in dry earth. By 1180, the Taira were hated across the land. And Yoritomo, now a grown man living in exile in Izu, saw his moment. He raised the Minamoto banner. Once more, and this time, he wasn't alone. Samurai from across Japan joined him, not just out of loyalty, but out of desperation. They were tired of the Taira's dominance. And they saw in Yoritomo a new kind of leader. Quiet, calculating, and determined. The Genpei War had begun. This wasn't a clean two-army conflict. It was a messy, sprawling civil war that raged across rivers, forests, and mountains. Entire provinces were razed. Castles changed hands weekly. Families were torn apart, and samurai often had to choose between honor and survival. One of the most tragic stories from this war is that of Yoshitsune, Yoritomo's half-brother. Yoshitsune was a military genius, charismatic, bold, and beloved. By his troops, led the Minamoto to victory at the Battle of Ichinari, where he famously rode his horse down a near vertical cliff to surprise the Taira forces below. It was a maneuver so daring it sounded like fiction, but it was real. Then came the Battle of Dan-Nura in 1185, a naval showdown in the inland sea. The Taira, desperate and cornered, faced the full might of the Minamoto. In the end, they were betrayed from within, their fleet scattered. As the tide turned, Taira no Kiyomori's grandson, just a child, was thrown into the sea by his grandmother to avoid capture. His name was Emperor Antoku. He drowned with the imperial sword in his hands. The war was over. The Taira were finished. With victory secured, Minamoto no Yoritomo returned to Kyoto. But he didn't take the throne. He didn't need to. Instead, he did. Something more innovative, something far more lasting. In 1192, he was granted the title of Sai to Shogun, or simply Shogun Barbarians, being Generalissimo. It was a mouthful. But the title meant one thing: ultimate military authority. Yoritomo established his base in Kamakura, far from the corrupt court in Kyoto. From there, he created Japan's first shogunate, a military government that ruled. In the emperor's name, but held the true power in its hands. It was a masterstroke. The emperor stayed on the throne but became a figurehead. The samurai were now the ruling class. And Bushido was no longer a loose idea. It was the law of the land. But with power comes paranoia. Yoritomo grew increasingly suspicious of his own brother, Yoshitsune. Despite Yoshitsune's heroism, his popularity threatened the shogun's control. Rumors spread. Accusations flew. Eventually, Yoritomo branded his brother a traitor. Yoshitsune fled north and lived on the run, pursued by assassins. He died by his own hand, a tragic end to a brilliant warrior betrayed by politics. It's a chilling reminder in the world of the samurai. Loyalty could be a blade with two edges. Still, the Kamakura shogunate had been born, and with it, a New Japan samurai were no longer just hired swords. They were bureaucrats, landowners, and governors. They wore armor by day and managed estates by night. They wielded both blade and brush. The land was far from peaceful. But for the first time, it had structure, a system where warriors ruled, not nobles. And yet, the seeds of future chaos were already planted, because power in Japan had never stayed still for long. And as the generations passed, new clans, new threats, and new ambitions would rise, each one sharper than the last. Ashikaga. Shadows in the age of chaos, the Kamakura shogunate had brought order. But order, like glass, is always one crack away from shattering. For over a century, Japan had a working system. The emperor sat on the throne, the shogun pulled the strings, and the samurai upheld the balance. But power, especially when shared, is fragile. And when ambition creeps into that balance, chaos is never far behind. Welcome to the Ashikaga era, time of shifting loyalties, backroom betrayals, and full-blown civil war. If the Kamakura period was a steady march, the Ashikaga years were a freefall. Let's trace how Japan descended into nearly 2 centuries of darkness, and why the samurai, once symbols of stability, became both destroyers and survivors in an age of total chaos. It starts with a storm, a literal one. In the late 13th century, Japan faced 2 massive invasions by Kublai Khan, the Mongol emperor of China. The Mongols were the most feared warriors in the world, disciplined, brutal, and overwhelming in numbers. But both invasion attempts in 1274 and again in 1281 were thwarted by fierce Japanese resistance, and, crucially, by typhoons that tore the Mongol fleets apart. These storms were called kamikaze divine winds. To the Japanese, it felt like the gods themselves had stepped in to protect the land. But there was a price. Defending Japan had drained the Kamakura government financially. There were no spoils of war, only debts. The samurai who had fought received little or no reward. Discontent spread. Cracks began to form in the shogunate's control, and in 1333, those cracks exploded. Enter Emperor Godego, a bold, ambitious ruler who was sick of being a figurehead. Like his passive predecessors, he wanted real power back in the imperial court. He found an ally in Ashikaga Takeuji, a powerful samurai general. Together, they overthrew the Kamakura shogunate. For a brief moment, it seemed like the emperor had reclaimed authority. But then, betrayal. Ashikaga Takeuji turned on the emperor, took Kyoto, and declared a new shogunate this time, under his name. It was a bold move, and a messy one. From the start, the Ashikaga shogunate was built on shaky ground. 2 rival courts, one in Kyoto under the Ashikaga, the other in Yoshino under Godego, claimed legitimacy. This was the beginning of the Nanbokucho period. The northern and southern courts, samurai across Japan had to choose a side. Those choices tore families and provinces apart. While the Ashikaga held Kyoto, they struggled to hold Japan. Unlike the Kamakura shoguns who governed from afar in Kamakura, the Ashikaga ruled directly from the capital, and that meant they were constantly embroiled in court politics, palace intrigues, and power plays. From rival daimyo, Takeuji's descendants weren't as strong as he was. They couldn't enforce unity. And without unity, well, you know what happens next? By the mid-1400s, the shogunate's control had all but collapsed. Powerful warlords stopped listening to Kyoto. Samurai bands began carving up the country for themselves. Villages built fortresses. Castles multiplied, like wildfire. And then came the breaking point. The Rōnin War, 1467 to 1477. At first, it was just a succession dispute. 2 powerful families, the Hosokawa and the Yamana, fought over who should be the next shogun. But in Kyoto, their armies clashed so fiercely that the entire city burned. Temples, homes, markets, everything was destroyed. Kyoto, the heart of Japanese culture, was reduced to smoldering ash. The war dragged on for 10 years and solved nothing, but it broke everything. The central government never recovered. What followed was pure anarchy. Japan fell into a century-long free-for-all, known as the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period. It was one of the bloodiest, most chaotic eras in Japanese history. Imagine it. Over 100 competing domains. Warlords are rising and falling every few years. Alliances forged in the morning and betrayed by nightfall. The samurai, once noble warriors upholding order, now served whoever could pay them best. Some became Rōnin, masterless and roaming. Others became petty kings, building mini-empires, with walls of stone and rivers of blood. What Bushido meant during this time depended on who you asked. For some, it still meant honor and loyalty. For others, it was survival. But even in this chaos, there was beauty. This was the age when Japanese castle architecture reached its peak. Massive stone fortresses like Himegi and Matsumoto began to rise. The complex moats and winding passageways, designed to confuse attackers. The tea ceremony evolved into a sacred ritual, a moment of peace amidst the madness. Zen Buddhism flourished in art, garden design, and poetry, and even the samurai, for all their brutality, maintained a strange kind of grace. They could slit a throat in the morning, then compose a haiku by twilight. It was a world of extremes: beauty and violence, loyalty and betrayal, silence and screams. One warlord stood out during this time: Oda Nobunaga. Ambitious, ruthless, and brilliant, he began uniting the fractured clans through a brutal campaign of warfare and diplomacy. His rise marked the beginning of the end for the Sengoku period, but we'll dive deeper into his story and the warlords who followed in the next chapter. For now, remember this: the Ashikaga didn't fall with a bang. They crumbled like paper in the rain, not because they were weak, but because Japan had outgrown them. The samurai had become more than servants to power. They were power, and they were about to reshape Japan all over again. Warlords and castles. The Sengoku era power in this era didn't come from birthright. It came from the sword. The Sengoku Jidai, Japan's warring states period, was not just a civil war. It was a complete collapse of centralized rule, a nationwide Game of Thrones. With hundreds of players and no rules, what started as the failure of the Ashikaga shogunate became a brutal Darwinian competition. Provinces turned into private kingdoms. Local daimyo warlords stopped answering to Kyoto. They stopped pretending. And as samurai scrambled for survival, a new kind of leader began to rise. Not aristocrats, not courtly nobles, but self-made men who climbed to the top on a pile of bodies and broken oaths. Welcome to the age of Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, the three men who would fight, build, and outmaneuver their way into history. Let's start with the most unpredictable of them all. Oda Nobunaga, born in 1534. Nobunaga was a strange figure even among the warlords. He dressed in bizarre clothing, acted erratically in public, and was mocked as a fool in his youth. But behind the mask, genius. When his father died, Nobunaga seized control of the Oda clan by force, even going so far as to kill his own brother. Then he began expanding his power, not just with brute strength, but with something rare in that era: strategy. He used firearms, introduced to Japan just a few decades earlier by Portuguese traders, more effectively than any warlord before him. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, Nobunaga used massed volleys of muskets to decimate the famous cavalry of the Takeda clan. It wasn't just a victory. It was the end of traditional warfare in Japan. He had turned gunfire into chess. Nobunaga was brutal, even by Sengoku standards. He burned entire temples that opposed him. He had monks slaughtered, crushed the power of Buddhist warrior orders that had ruled parts of Japan for centuries. But it wasn't madness, it was method. He wanted one thing: unification. By the 1580s, Nobunaga controlled most of central Japan. He built castles like Azuchi, not just as fortresses, but as symbols. Massive, lavish, designed to intimidate and impress. He wanted not only to rule Japan, but to redefine what the rule meant. But then, in 1582, just as he was on the cusp of total domination, betrayal struck. One of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, turned on him. Nobunaga was attacked in a temple outside Kyoto. Rather than be captured, he committed seppuku ritual suicide as the flames closed in. The fool of a wari had almost conquered Japan, and now he was gone. Enter Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Hideyoshi's story feels almost mythical. He was born a peasant, the son of a foot soldier, in a world where that background should have meant lifelong obscurity. But Hideyoshi had something you couldn't buy or inherit: charm, cunning, and charisma. He started as a sandal bearer under Nobunaga. Step by step, he climbed the ranks through loyalty, wit, and brilliance on the battlefield. And when Nobunaga died, Hideyoshi wasted no time. He avenged his fallen master by defeating Mitsuhide just days later. Then, through a mix of diplomacy and intimidation, he brought the fractured Oda loyalists under his command. By 1590, Hideyoshi had succeeded where even Nobunaga had failed. He unified nearly all of Japan. But there was a catch. Because he came from a peasant background, Hideyoshi could never be shogun. The title was off-limits to commoners. So instead, he took the title of Kampuku Imperial Regent, which gave him near total control of the court. He enacted reforms to solidify his rule. Land surveys to determine taxes and ownership. Weapon confiscation from peasants, separating farmers from fighters. A strict class system that locked people into their roles. No more peasants becoming warriors to keep samurai loyal. He allowed them to collect taxes from their lands, but forbade them from farming themselves. Their lives became tied to service and their lord's fortune. Hideyoshi ruled Japan like a master conductor. But he wasn't done yet. In an unexpected twist, Hideyoshi set his sights beyond Japan. In 1592, he launched a massive invasion of Korea, hoping to conquer China eventually. It was an ambitious, some might say delusional, campaign. The war dragged on. Japanese forces initially made gains, but were bogged down by stiff Korean resistance and Ming Chinese reinforcements. Korean naval commander Yi Sun-sin, with his famed turtle ships, decimated Japanese supply lines. By 1598, Hideyoshi was dying. The campaign collapsed. The invasion had failed, and with Hideyoshi gone, a new power vacuum emerged. This is where Tokugawa Ieyasu steps into the spotlight. If Nobunaga was fire and Hideyoshi was wind, Ieyasu was stone, patient, cold, and immovable. He had served both Nobunaga and Hideyoshi faithfully. But when Hideyoshi died, Ieyasu saw his chance. A power struggle broke out between Ieyasu and the remaining loyalists of the Toyotomi clan, mostly centered around Hideyoshi's young, unprepared son. The conflict came to a head in 1600 at the Battle of Sekigahara, the most significant and most decisive battle in samurai history. Over 160,000 troops clashed. Treachery, ambush, and fog shaped the battlefield. In the end, Ieyasu emerged victorious. 3 years later, in 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu was granted the title of shogun. The samurai had gone from chaos to consolidation in under a century. But this time, it would stick. Ieyasu wasn't just building a government. He was building a system that would last 260 years. We'll explore the details of that peaceful, rigid system in the next chapter. But here's what you need to remember from the Sengoku era. Castles rose. Thousands died. Samurai became soldiers of fortune and of fate. 3 men, very different in style, remade the nation. Nobunaga destroyed, Hideyoshi unified, and Ieyasu endured. It was a time when the sword ruled everything. The sharpest minds, not just blades, won the war. Samurai at peace. The Tokugawa order: what happens to a warrior when there are no more wars? For centuries, the samurai had defined themselves through battle, through honor won and lost on the blade's edge. But in 1603, everything changed. The age of chaos was over. The sword was sheathed, and the warrior act became something else entirely. This is the story of the Tokugawa shogunate, a regime that ruled Japan for more than 2.5 centuries, a time of peace, isolation, and structure so rigid it nearly froze a nation in place. For the samurai, it was a golden age and a quiet crisis. Because what is a samurai without war? Let's rewind to the moment it began. In 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu became shogun. He had seen Nobunaga rise in fire and Hideyoshi in fury, chose another path: endurance. He moved the center of power to a sleepy fishing village called Edo modern-day Tokyo and began constructing not just a city, but a system, one that would shape every part of Japanese life for the next 260 years. The Tokugawa system was built on a straightforward idea: control everything, and they did. They began with the daimyo, the powerful regional lords who had caused so much chaos during the Sengoku era. Under the new rule, daimyo were divided into 3 classes: allies, outer lords, and relatives. They were all required to swear loyalty to the Tokugawa, and more importantly, follow a new policy called senkenkati, or alternate attendance. Here's how it worked. Every other year, daimyo had to leave their domains and travel to Edo, bringing with them lavish entourages and gifts. They had to build a mansion in the capital and live there for months away from their own land and armies. Meanwhile, their families remained in Edo, essentially as hostages. This wasn't just clever, it was genius. It drained the daimyo of resources. It kept them under watch. And it ensured no one could rise up without someone they loved being caught in the crossfire. With the warlords tamed, Tokugawa turned their attention to the population. They created a rigid class system. Samurai at the top, the warrior administrators, peasants, were valued for producing food. Artisans are respected for their craftsmanship. Merchants the lowest, right, because they made money from others' work. Ironically, over time, the merchants would become the richest of all. But officially, status was everything. You were born into your class, and that was that. Mobility was almost impossible. Even fashion was regulated. Commoners couldn't wear certain colors. The samurai had to follow specific rules of behavior. How to walk, speak, bow, and even die. Japan had become a living scroll ordered beautiful. Still, but peace is a double-edged sword. The samurai, for the first time in history, found themselves without enemies to fight. With no wars, they became bureaucrats, tax collectors, clerks, legal officers. They still wore their swords, still trained in the martial arts, but they were more pen than katana now. Some adjusted, others struggled. You can imagine it. A man raised from childhood to kill in the name of honor, suddenly told to sit at a desk and check rice inventories. Some became philosophical, diving deep into Zen, Confucianism, or the study of Bushido. Others became disillusioned, turning to drink, gambling, or even rebellion. There's a quiet sadness to this era, a sense of warriors trying to remember who they were. And yet, this was also a time of incredible cultural growth. With peace came prosperity. Cities grew, roads connected distant provinces, markets thrived, art flourished, the ukiyo-e woodblock prints, the kabuki theater, the refined elegance of haiku poetry. Samurai like Matsuo Bashu traded blades for brushes, writing verses that still echo today. On a withered branch, a crow has alighted autumn evening. There was a haunting beauty in this stillness, as if Japan had turned into one vast meditation, and Edo itself transformed into one of the largest cities in the world. Full of canals, marketplaces, and vibrant street life. Yet beneath it all was discipline, a constant, unyielding order. The Tokugawa also turned Japan inward. In 1635, they issued the Sakoku Edict, closing the country to almost all foreign influence. Japanese were forbidden to travel abroad, and foreign merchants were restricted to a single island port in Nagasaki. Christianity, which had been spreading since the Portuguese arrived in the 1500s, was outlawed. Converts were persecuted, as foreign books were banned, Japan had slammed the door shut to the outside world. It looked like Japan had disappeared. But inside, life went on carefully, quietly, like a garden pruned to perfection, and the samurai stood guard over it all. Still, not all was as calm. As it seemed, beneath the surface, pressures were building. The merchant class was growing richer, while samurai locked into fixed stipends were often in debt. Some couldn't afford to maintain their status and fell into quiet poverty. At the same time, rural famines, overtaxation, and natural disasters triggered unrest. Peasant uprisings flared. Samurai-led protests occasionally shook the peace, but the Tokugawa regime held firm for now, until the Black Ships came in 1853. After over 200 years of isolation, the United States arrived with gunboats and a message. Open your ports, or else the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry shattered the illusion of Japan's isolation. The samurai were stunned, their world so carefully maintained. Suddenly felt fragile against Western firepower. The Tokugawa signed treaties. Ports were opened, foreign influence rushed in, and just like that, the cracks appeared. A generation of samurai, raised to believe Japan was eternal, began questioning everything. Who are we without our swords? Without our rules? Without the control we once had? But those questions will be answered in time. For now, understand this. The Tokugawa era was a masterpiece of order, stable, elegant, and deeply Japanese. But like all masterpieces, it eventually aged. The colors faded, the frame cracked, and as Japan stood at the edge of the modern world, the samurai would soon have to choose: hold the old line, or step into a storm they didn't understand. The way of the sword, weapons, training, and rituals makes a samurai a samurai? Is it the armor? The battlefield? The loyalty to a lord? In truth, the core of a samurai wasn't any of those things. It was the sword. To a samurai, the sword wasn't just a tool. It was the soul. In this chapter, we enter the daily world of the warrior, not in war but in discipline. From the forge to the DJ, from morning rituals to the final act of seppuku. We'll explore the sacred craft of being a samurai, the weapons they carried, the brutal training they endured, and the spiritual code that defined their lives and their deaths. Let's begin with the most iconic blade in history, the katana. The katana. Steel with a soul curved, elegant, lethal. The katana is more than a sword, it's a symbol. Every inch of it is layered with meaning, the curve that makes the draw smooth and fast, the single edge honed to deadly sharpness, and the mysterious hamon, the wave-like temper line visible on the blade, a result of the precise forging process. But making a katana wasn't just metallurgy, it was ritual. Forging a single blade could take weeks. Master swordsmiths, like those from the famed Busan and Yamato schools, purified themselves before beginning. The steel, often folded hundreds of times, was heated, hammered, quenched, and polished with almost religious care. The result? A blade that could slice through flesh, yes, but also endure generations of use. Some katanas were passed down as heirlooms. Others were buried with their masters. To draw one without cause was taboo. To lose one was shame. It was said a samurai without his sword is a man without his soul, beyond the katana. The full arsenal, though the katana stole the spotlight, it was rarely the only weapon a samurai carried. Wakizashi, a shorter companion blade, often worn with the katana as a daishu pair. The wakizashi served as a backup and was usually the weapon used in ritual suicide, seppuku tantu, a dagger. Useful in close quarters or as a last resort. Yumi, the Japanese longbow. Before swords became dominant, archery was the primary samurai skill. These asymmetrical bows were powerful and precise, used in both ground and horseback combat. Yari and naginata, spears and polearms. While less glamorous, these were practical, battlefield weapons, offering reach and control. Naginata, with its curved blade on a long shaft, was often associated with samurai women. A samurai wasn't just trained to fight with one weapon. They were trained to become the weapon. Training. A lifetime of disciplined samurai training started young. Boys born into samurai families began martial instruction around the age of 5. By 12 or 13, they were expected to know the basics of swordsmanship, horseback riding, and archery. But it wasn't just about fighting, it was about control. In the DJ, every movement was repeated thousands of times. Sword forms kata were practiced with wooden swords bakken again and again, until the body reacted before the mind could even think. Training wasn't loud or chaotic. It was quiet, focused, meditative. You didn't scream your way through a fight. You flowed through it. And beyond combat, samurai were trained in calligraphy, to control the hand, poetry, to refine the mind, Zen meditation, to still the heart. Why? Because battle is chaos. The only way to survive it is not to be moved. Rituals, life, death, and everything between the samurai lived every day with death in mind, not in a grim, hopeless way, but as a reminder, nothing is permanent. This was at the heart of both Zen Buddhism and Bushido. Morning rituals were every day: tea, sword inspection, and prayer. Every motion carried intention. Even how a samurai sat, bowed, tied his sash followed strict etiquette. But no ritual was more feared or more revered than seppuku, also known as harakiri. This was ritual suicide, a means of preserving honor after disgrace, failure, or loss of a lord. It was not a moment of weakness. It was an offering. Performed in silence, the samurai would kneel in formal attire, write a death poem, and plunge the wakizashi into their abdomen. In later periods, a second, the kishakunin, would decapitate him swiftly after the initial cut out of mercy. Seppuku wasn't required by law, but Bushido demanded it. The sword and the spirit, the deeper you go into samurai life, the more you realize this wasn't about violence. It was about discipline. The samurai was trained not just to strike, but not to strike. To know when the blade belonged in its sheath. This restraint came from Bushido. It's a samurai code, a mix of Shinto loyalty, Buddhist serenity, and Confucian ethics. The code emphasized Gai justice, Rei respect you courage, honor. Chigi loyalty, Makoto sincerity. Bushido was never written as a single law, but it was felt in every act. A warrior didn't just kill well, he lived well. And when the time came, he died beautifully. The paradox of power. But here's a question worth asking. What happens when the warrior is no longer needed? During the Tokugawa era, as peace took hold, many samurai found themselves clinging to tradition. Training with swords they would never draw in combat, practicing rituals for battles that would never come. Some embraced this, finding purpose in ceremony and poetry. Others grew bitter, lost, disconnected. They became Rōnin, masterless samurai wandering the land, feared by villagers, hired as mercenaries or thugs. The sword, once a symbol of honor, became a burden. The code, once a source of pride, became a prison. And still, they practiced. Still, they polished their blades and whispered the words of Bushido, even as the world around them began to forget. In the next chapter, we'll meet these forgotten warriors, the ones who slipped through the cracks of peace, the Rōnin legends. Rebels, ghosts of a vanishing age, because even in silence, the samurai spirit never truly faded. The Rōnin, masterless, mythic, and dangerous, the samurai lived by a code. They fought for honor. They served their lords with absolute loyalty. But what happens when that lord dies, or worse, falls from power? It happens when your code remains. But the world forgets you. So you become a Rōnin. The word itself is poetic, even tragic. It means wave man, a person adrift, like a wave in the ocean, no anchor, no lord, to some. Rōnin were romantic heroes, wandering sworders, seeking justice. To others, they were dangerous outcasts, failed samurai who turned to crime. In truth, they were both. And their stories are some of the most haunting, human, unforgettable in all of Japanese history. let's walk alongside them. Becoming a Rōnin in feudal Japan. A samurai's identity was inseparable from his daimyo, his feudal lord. That relationship was sacred. Lose your lord and you've lost more than just employment. You've lost your purpose. Some Rōnin were created by tragedy, their lords killed in battle, executed, or stripped of land. Others became Rōnin by choice, refusing to serve corrupt masters, or abandoning posts after defeat. In the rigid Tokugawa system, this was a disaster. There were no second chances. Once masterless, you were tainted, distrusted, pitied, and often feared. You couldn't legally carry a sword, you couldn't hold land, and you couldn't belong yet. Thousands of Rōnin wandered Japan. Life on the margins, life as a Rōnin was hard, not just physically, but spiritually. These were trained warriors with no wars to fight. Men who had memorized Bushido now had to beg, teach swordsmanship for food, or take work as guards in remote towns. Some became bandits, others became poets. Few even became revolutionaries. In the cities, Rōnin were both admired and avoided like wild animals. Their swords were sharp, their tempers sharper. Without a code to bind them, many lived by their own rules, but not all were lost causes. Some Rōnin dedicated their lives to protecting villagers from corrupt officials. Others offered their blades to help those who couldn't defend themselves. A proto-form of vigilante justice, they were living contradictions. Loyal men without loyalty, bound to Bushido, but forced to survive outside it. The 47 Rōnin, a legend born if there is one story that defines the Rōnin. It's this. The tale of the 47 Rōnin. It begins in Itenshibailing-yi. At Ito Castle, a young daimyo named Asano Naganori was humiliated by a corrupt court official, Hira Yoshinaka, during a ceremonial visit. Pushed too far, Asano drew his sword, an act forbidden within the castle, and wounded Kira. For this breach of conduct, Asano was ordered to commit seppuku. His lands were confiscated. His samurai were cast out. Now, 47 of those men suddenly Rōnin had a choice, accept their fate, or seek revenge. They chose vengeance. For 2 years, they pretended to move on. Some became merchants. Others vanished into the countryside, all while secretly planning. Then, on a snowy night in 1703, they struck. They broke into Kira's mansion, overwhelmed his guards, and killed him. Then, they marched calmly to Asano's grave, laid Kira's severed head at the tomb, and turned themselves in. The shogunate was torn. They had broken the law, but upheld. Bushido. In the end, they were ordered to commit seppuku, allowed to die as samurai, not executed as criminals. They were buried together. Their graves remain a sacred site to this day. The 47 Rōnin became legends. Proof that even without a master, honor could still live. Rōnin in pop culture and legacy in modern Japan. And around the world, the image of the Rōnin endures. From films like Harakiri and The Twilight Samurai, to global pop culture icons like Lone Wolf and Cub, Ghost of Tsushima, and even Star Wars Jedi, the archetype of the wandering, masterless warrior still resonates. Why? Because the Rōnin isn't just a historical figure. He's a symbol of what happens when honor meets hardship. When the system fails, but the soul refuses to. In many ways, the Rōnin is the most human of all the samurai. Not a perfect warrior, bound by structure, but a flawed man navigating a broken world with dignity, grief, and a blade. The tragedy of freedom at first glance, you might think being a Rōnin was freedom. No lord. No rules, no obligations, but in a culture built entirely on duty, that kind of freedom was a curse. Rōnin were often trapped between eras. Too honorable to become mercenaries, too proud to beg, too bound by Bushido to adapt to a world that no longer had a place for them. Many died in obscurity. Many more disappeared. But some, like the 47, carved their names into stone. They didn't just keep the samurai spirit alive. They reminded Japan what it really meant. And yet, even the Rōnin would fade with time, because soon everything would change. Foreign ships, black powder, a new government, and with it, the end of the samurai. But not before one last act. 1. Final rebellion. That's where we go next. The fall of the samurai, rebellion and revolution for centuries. The samurai stood at the heart of Japan, warriors, rulers, philosophers. They shaped empires, served lords, and held the soul of the nation in steel. But by the mid-1800s, the world had changed, and the samurai could not hold it back. This is the story of how a warrior class, once untouchable, found itself outmatched by muskets, trade treaties, and shifting ideals. It's the story of quiet resistance and one last violent stand. It's the story of how the samurai fell, not just in battle, but in meaning. Let's begin with the ships that shattered their silence. The black ships arrive in 1853. For American warships under Commodore Matthew, Perry steamed into Edo Bay. They weren't just ships, they were floating fortresses, black smoke, iron holes, cannons the likes of which Japan had never seen. Their message: open your ports to trade, or face consequences. The Tokugawa shogunate, after 2 centuries of isolation, was stunned. Their own ships were wooden and outdated. Their weapons were no match. And the samurai, proud and disciplined, were armed with swords in a world now ruled by rifles. In 1854, the shogunate signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, opening Japan to American trade. More treaties followed, more Western nations came. And with each one, the authority of the shogun weakened. Japan wasn't just opening up to the world. It was unraveling from the inside. Samurai identity crisis for the samurai. It was a spiritual earthquake. They had trained for war. They had lived by a strict moral code. Now they were being asked to accept foreign merchants, foreign religions. Foreign laws? Many couldn't. They saw their traditions being sold off like antiques. Their swords, once sacred, now mocked as relics. Even worse, the merchant class, once at the bottom of the social ladder, was getting more prosperous and more powerful. Meanwhile, samurai stipends remained fixed, and inflation eroded their livelihoods. Some samurai took up jobs as teachers or bureaucrats. Others quietly resented the changing tides. And a few began plotting rebellion. The Boshin War. Samurai vs. samurai. The tension boiled over in the 1860s. The imperial court in Kyoto, long a ceremonial relic, was stirring. A growing movement fueled by young, idealistic samurai demanded the restoration of power to the emperor and the expulsion of foreigners. They called themselves Chichi, men of high purpose. Their slogan, Sanji, revere the emperor. Expel the barbarians. Clashes turned deadly. Shogunate officials were assassinated in the streets. Factions began to form, some supporting the old shogunate, others backing the imperial cause. By 1868, civil war erupted, the Boshin War. On one side, the Tokugawa loyalists, led by seasoned samurai still clinging to the old world. On the other, imperial forces, backed by progressive daimyo and modern weaponry. It was a brutal, fast-moving conflict. Battles fought in fields, forests, and castle towns. The imperial army used modern rifles and even warships. The Tokugawa side, while fierce, was outgunned. The final blow came at the Battle of Hakodate in 1869. The last Tokugawa loyalists, holed up in Japan's northern frontier, made a doomed last stand in a Western-style fortress. They were crushed. The war was over. The emperor was restored, and the Meiji era had begun. The Meiji Restoration. A new Japan in 1868. Emperor Meiji declared a new order. Japan would modernize fast. It would adopt Western industry, technology, and military structure. The old feudal domains were abolished. A new conscript army was formed. National schools were built. Railways appeared. But for the samurai, this was devastating. In 1871, the samurai class was officially dissolved. Their stipends were cut. Their rights to wear swords in public were revoked. Their role, their very identity was erased. Imagine being part of a proud warrior caste for centuries, and then, in the span of a decade, being told, you're obsolete now. The last stand. Satsuma Rebellion. Not all samurai accepted this quietly. In 1877, the greatest and final samurai rebellion erupted in Satsuma. Led by a legendary figure, Seigo Takamori, Seigo had once been a hero of the Meiji Restoration. He helped topple the shogunate.
Ow!
But now, seeing his fellow samurai stripped of status and honor, he turned against the very government he helped create. He led over 20,000 former samurai in open rebellion, armed mostly with swords and limited rifles, facing the full force of Japan's modern conscript army. The war was brief and bloody at Shiroyama. Outnumbered and surrounded, Seigo's forces made their last stand. He was wounded in battle. The samurai era truly ended. A legacy that wouldn't die. The swords were gone. The top knots were shaved. The Bushido code was no longer law. And yet, the spirit of the samurai did not vanish. In the decades that followed, Bushido was reinvented, taught in schools, adapted for soldiers, even used to shape Japan's national identity. Leading into the 20th century, samurai ideals, loyalty, sacrifice, discipline, were polished into myth. They inspired everything from military officers to manga heroes. But the truth is more complicated. The samurai didn't vanish. They transformed. Some became writers, politicians, philosophers. Others faded into quiet poverty or forgotten. The fall of the samurai was not just a historical event. It was a human story of pride, loss, courage, and change. They lived for war. They died in peace. And in between, they helped shape the soul of a nation. The legacy of the samurai. Bushido. In the modern world, the swords are sheathed. The castles are ruins. The samurai are no more. And yet somehow, their spirit lives on. In business meetings. In martial arts DJ. In films, poetry, national holidays. The samurai may have faded from Japan's streets, but they never left its heart. How does a culture carry a warrior legacy into a world of peace, technology, and democracy? This is the story of how Bushido, the samurai's invisible armor, survived death, and how it still shapes Japan, maybe even your world today. Bushido. The code that wouldn't die. Bushido, often translated as the way of the warrior, was never a single book or law. It was a culture, a collection of values and expectations, passed down through generations. Loyalty, courage, honor, self-discipline, duty, in the samurai era, was lived more than explained. But in the modern era, people began to study it. He published Bushido, The Soul of Japan, written in English for Western readers. He described the samurai code as a blend of Zen, Confucianism, feudal loyalty, a moral compass that emphasized character over conquest. His book was read worldwide, even by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. It framed the samurai not as killers, but as philosophers with swords. The world was captivated, and Japan, entering the modern age, began to redefine itself around that image. Bushido and the military and national identity in the early 20th century, as Japan industrialized and militarized, Bushido was adapted again. This time, with a sharper edge. The values of loyalty, honor, and sacrifice were taught to soldiers. School children recited oaths of obedience and devotion. The emperor was presented as a divine figure worthy of absolute loyalty. Like a daimyo of old, this version of Bushido was more rigid, more aggressive. It fueled nationalism. And during World War II, it played a key role in shaping Japan's military behavior. Soldiers were told that surrender was dishonor. Pilots volunteered for kamikaze missions, giving their lives for their homeland. Much like samurai might fall for their lord. But this wasn't the Bushido of poetry and restraint. It was a Bushido twisted by politics and by war. Post-war. Reckoning. What now? After 1945, everything changed. Japan surrendered. The emperor declared he was not divine. The country was occupied, disarmed, and forced to rewrite its constitution. For many, it felt like the final death of the samurai dream. But here's the twist. In the ashes of defeat, Bushido re-emerged. Not in war, but in the quiet rituals of everyday life, a businessman bowing deeply before a deal, a martial artist sweeping the DJ before practice, a student refusing to cut corners on a final project. Honor, discipline, respect, endurance. These weren't just words. They were ghosts of the samurai past. Japan rebuilt not by rejecting its traditions, but by reshaping them. The samurai spirit. In business and culture, have you ever heard the phrase, "The company is your lord"? In post-war Japan, the workplace became the new battlefield. Employees swore loyalty to their companies. Long hours, personal sacrifice. Group harmony became expected. This salaryman culture reflected the old samurai ideals, repackaged for a modern economy. Meanwhile, cultural exports carried the samurai myth worldwide. Akira Kurosawa's films, like Seven Samurai and Yojimbo, introduced stoic, tragic warriors to the West. Anime and manga reimagined the Rōnin as sci-fi rebels and wandering sworders. Video, things like Ghost of Tsushima, let players walk the razor's edge of honor and necessity. Even Star Wars borrowed from the samurai, with Jedi robes, swords, and moral codes that echo Bushido. The world didn't just learn about samurai. It absorbed them. Martial arts, living traditions while the battlefield disappeared. The sword did martial arts like kendo, the way of the sword. Sword drawing and kaido archery are still practiced across Japan and globally. These aren't just sports, they're rituals. Every bow, every step, every breath is steeped in tradition, a moving meditation on control and presence. And the goal, not to defeat an opponent, but to defeat the self. That, at its core, is the most enduring part of the samurai spirit. Victory begins within. Modern Bushido, a global reflection today. Bushido doesn't belong to Japan alone. Its values have found homes in martial arts studios, from Brazil to Berlin, in self-help books, in leadership training, even in memes. Why? Because in a world full of noise, distraction, and self-interest, the idea of living by a quiet code of having something to stand for is rare and deeply attractive. You don't need a sword to be a samurai. You need integrity. The sword and the silence, the samurai, are gone. But the silence they cultivated, the discipline, the presence, the purpose, still echoes. Every time someone honors a promise, every time someone chooses principle over gain, every time someone stands their ground, even when no one's watching, Bushido lives again. It's not about battle. It's about how you live, how you serve, how you endure. And yet one final piece remains, because even with the myths, the movies, and the martial arts, the samurai left something else behind, something real, something you can touch. Let's end our journey by holding their legacy in our hands, their armor, their swords, their scrolls, and walking through the quiet halls where their ghosts still stand. Echoes of the blade, preserving samurai history. Today the samurai may be gone, no longer riding through mountain passes or standing watch over castle gates. But they are far from forgotten. Their stories live in our books. Their armor stands behind glass. Swords, carefully polished, centuries old, still shimmer with the spirit of their makers. In this final chapter, we'll step into the present day to see how Japan and the world preserves the samurai. Legacy. Museums, temples, swordsmiths, living traditions, and even descendants of samurai families who still carry the weight of that ancient name. Because even if the warrior has vanished, the echo of his blade still rings in steel and silence. Samurai, armor, history cast in iron step into any major museum in Japan. Tokyo National Museum, Kyoto's Museum of Traditional Crafts, or even local history centers, and you'll see it. Yoroi, armor, worn and weathered, displayed like sacred relics, the helmets kabuto with their winged crests, the lacquered cuirasses, D etched with clan, symbols, the layered shoulder plates sewed and thigh guards high-date elegant, terrifying beautiful. Each piece tells a story. It's not just of war, but of identity. Samurai didn't just wear armor, they spoke through it. Color schemes, helmet ornaments, and motifs all signaled family, region, and even philosophy. Some helmets were shaped like demon faces, others like lotus flowers. It was art and intimidation and legacy all at once. And today, artisans still study these pieces, preserving techniques that would otherwise be lost. The swordsmiths, forging the past unwound. Then, there are the swords, real katana, forged by hand, folded steel. What? Razor sharp and soul deep are still made in Japan. Only a handful of licensed swordsmiths remain, certified by the government and trained in lineages that stretch back centuries. Forging a katana is not industrial. It is a sacred ritual. Each blade can take weeks. The steel must be folded, hammered, tempered, and shaped in precise harmony with temperature and time. The smith must pray, focus, and obey the old rules. And when the blade is complete, curved, and perfect, it's more than a weapon. It's a link to a lost world. Collectors. Martial artists, museums, and even shrines acquire these swords not for use, but for memory. A well-made katana today can fetch tens of thousands of dollars. But its value isn't just in craft, it's in what it carries. Shrines, castles, and sacred grounds. Some places in Japan still feel like the samurai never left. Kumamoto Castle, with its black stone walls and towering gates, was a major samurai stronghold. Rebuilt after earthquakes, yet still haunted by its past. Himeji Castle, nicknamed the White Heron, stands in pristine silence, its white walls soaring like wings. It survived wars, fires, and modernization. Niku, TSHG Shrine. The resting place of Tokugawa Ieyasu is filled with gold leaf carvings and an air of solemn reverence. And then there are the graves, moss-covered tombs where samurai, daimyo, and even Rōnin are buried. Most famous are the graves of the Yuseiya Sisei Rōnin at Sengakuji Temple in Tokyo. Visitors still leave incense, letters, swords. People weep. People bow. Time may have passed, but honor doesn't forget. Martial arts. The samurai lives in motion, in DJ across Japan and the world. Samurai discipline still lives through Budo the martial way, Kendo, Ido, Gudo, Aikido. These aren't about violence. They're about presence. Every bow, every stance. Every strike is a kind of memory, a thread connecting student to master, master to ancient warrior. Even modern schools take inspiration from samurai ethics. Respect, humility, silence, and strength. Child practicing kendo in Osaka may never fight a real duel, but they learn to stand straight, to breathe deep, to mean what they do. That is Bushido. That is samurai. Living legacies, families, and bloodlines. Some samurai lineages still exist. They're not lords or warriors now, but they carry the names Takeda, Wasugi, Shimazu like heirlooms. Some work as historians, teachers, or museum curators. Others are artists or sword practitioners. In rare cases, they still live on ancestral land, old houses tucked into the countryside, filled with dusty scrolls and family crests. To them, being samurai isn't about war. It's about duty to memory, to tradition, something bigger than themselves. They teach their children what the world has forgotten, not how to kill, but how to stand. Pop culture and global reverence, from Hollywood blockbusters to anime epics. The image of the samurai remains one of the most powerful in global storytelling. The Last Samurai introduced many Western audiences to the romance of the samurai fall. Kurosawa's legacy lives in directors like George Lucas and Quentin Tarantino, manga like Rurouni Kenshin, Gabon, and Blade of the Immortal reimagined the Rōnin for new generations. Ghost of Tsushima, a Western-made game, was so respectfully crafted that Japanese audiences praised it as authentically Japanese, even in non-Japanese cultures. The samurai has become a metaphor for discipline, for doing the right thing, even when it costs everything. What the samurai taught us: So now that we've walked the entire road from the rise of feudal Japan to the modern-day DJ, one question remains: what did the samurai leave behind? For us, that honor isn't a word, it's a decision. That tradition isn't a chain, it's a compass. They taught us how to fall with dignity, how to serve with pride, how to live as if death could come at any moment and still not be feared. In the end, the samurai gave Japan and the world something beyond swords. They gave us a way to walk, not just in armor, but in life.